1777. The American Revolution stands at a crossroads. After 2 years of war, the dream of independence teeters on the edge of collapse.
In the summer of 1777, the American Revolution was failing, and the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, was running out of time and running out of soldiers because the British controlled New York City and occupied strategic positions along the Hudson River. And every battle that Washington fought seemed to end in defeat or stalemate. And the revolutionary cause that had looked promising just a year earlier was beginning to look like a hopeless rebellion that would be crushed by the most powerful military force on Earth. But in the forests and fields near the small town of Saratoga in upstate New York, something entirely unexpected was about to happen that would shock both sides of the conflict and prove that despite all the advantages of the British Army and all the resources of the British Empire, the American revolutionaries could win a decisive victory that would change the entire course of the war and convince a powerful foreign nation to join the fight against Britain. A British general named John Burgoyne was marching south from Canada with over 7,000 soldiers and a plan to capture the Hudson River and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, and he was confident in his ability to crush any American forces that opposed him. But what Burgoyne did not understand was that he was marching into a trap that would result in his complete defeat and his unconditional surrender to an American army that he had underestimated at every turn. But how did an American general, who had lost almost every battle he fought, manage to trap a British general who was considered one of the most capable commanders in the British Army? Why did Burgoyne surrender when he still had thousands of soldiers and supplies? And what made this single battle at Saratoga so important that it convinced the French to enter the war on America's side and transform what looked like a hopeless rebellion into a winnable conflict? The American Revolution began in April 1775, when British and American militia clashed at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and initial enthusiasm for independence seemed boundless as colonists rallied to fight for their freedom. But despite the bold declaration of independence announced in summer 1776, the military situation for the Americans was becoming desperate by the summer of 1777, because General George Washington had been defeated in a series of battles around New York City and had been forced to retreat across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, and the Continental Army had shrunk from thousands to a ragged force of exhausted soldiers running out of supplies and hope. The British strategy for 1777 was designed to crush the rebellion once and for all by capturing New York City, controlling the Hudson River, and cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies, because the British generals believed that if they could isolate New England and destroy Washington's army, the rebellion would collapse and the colonies would quickly submit to British authority. General John Burgoyne was given command of an army of approximately 7,000 soldiers, which included British regulars, German mercenaries hired from Hesse-Kassel, Canadian militia, and Native American warriors, and Burgoyne's orders were to march south from Canada along the Hudson River, capture the American fort at Ticonderoga, and then continue south to link up with British forces that were supposedly advancing north from New York City. Burgoyne was confident in his ability to accomplish this mission because he had a larger and better equipped army than any American force he was likely to encounter, because his soldiers were professional regulars with years of combat experience, and because he believed that most Americans were either too cowardly or too disorganized to stand against British soldiers in open battle. On June 17, 1777, Burgoyne's army crossed the border from Canada into New York and began marching south along the Hudson River Valley, and the Americans who opposed him seemed unable to stop his advance because the American general in charge of the Northern Theater was Philip Schuyler, and Schuyler did not have enough soldiers to match Burgoyne's numbers, and he was forced to retreat in the face of the British advance while burning crops and destroying bridges to slow down Burgoyne's progress. In early July 1777, Burgoyne attacked the American fort at Ticonderoga, which was held by American General Arthur St. Clair and a garrison of about 3,000 soldiers. But the fort was poorly positioned and could be surrounded, and St. Clair recognized that his position was untenable and ordered his soldiers to evacuate the fort before they could be trapped, and Burgoyne's army occupied Ticonderoga with minimal resistance. But as Burgoyne continued to march south, his supply lines began to stretch longer and longer, and the American soldiers he had defeated at Ticonderoga had not been destroyed, but had retreated and regrouped, and local militia was beginning to gather in increasing numbers to oppose his advance. The pivotal moment came when General Washington, recognizing the danger posed by Burgoyne's advance, sent one of his most capable officers, General Benedict Arnold, to command the American forces in the Northern Theater and to replace the defeated Schuyler, and Arnold arrived at the American camp near Saratoga in early September 1777, with a reputation as an aggressive and bold commander who was willing to take risks that other American generals would not consider. Arnold immediately began organizing the American forces and calling for local militia to come forward to fight against Burgoyne, and his aggressive attitude contrasted sharply with the defensive and cautious approach that Schuyler had been following. And Arnold's arrival seemed to energize the American soldiers and the local militia who had been demoralized by the defeats at Ticonderoga and elsewhere. By early September 1777, the American army commanded by Arnold had grown to approximately 7,000 soldiers, roughly equal in number to Burgoyne's force, and the American soldiers were fighting on their home territory where they understood the terrain and could operate effectively in the forests and hills that surrounded the British Army. Burgoyne's supply situation had become critical by this point in the campaign, because his long supply lines from Canada were vulnerable to American attacks and to the destruction of roads and bridges that the Americans were conducting to harass his army, and Burgoyne's horses were suffering from lack of adequate forage in the countryside around Saratoga, and his soldiers were running out of ammunition and supplies. On September 19, 1777, the first major battle at Saratoga took place when Burgoyne ordered his army to attack the American positions near Freeman's Farm, and the battle was fiercely contested, with the British and German soldiers attacking the American positions, while the American soldiers fought from behind trees and earthworks that provided them with defensive advantages. The fighting lasted throughout the day, with repeated charges by the British soldiers against the American positions, and the British regulars displayed the discipline and training that had made them one of the most feared armies in the world. But the Americans held their ground and inflicted heavy casualties on the British attackers, and by the end of the day, the British had suffered approximately 600 casualties, while the Americans had suffered approximately 300 casualties, a casualty ratio that should have been a clear victory for the American side, but which Burgoyne interpreted as a tactical success because his army had maintained possession of the battlefield at the end of the fighting. But despite this apparent tactical success, Burgoyne's strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly because his supply situation had become even more critical after the battle, and his soldiers were running short of food and ammunition, and the American army was growing larger every day as local militia continued to arrive. Burgoyne also received news that was devastating to his strategic plans. The British forces that were supposedly marching north from New York City to link up with his army were not coming, because instead of advancing north as planned, The British commander in New York had changed his orders and moved his forces south to attack Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting. And this meant that Burgoyne was stranded in the forests of upstate New York with no hope of being reinforced and no hope of linking up with other British forces. Facing this desperate situation, Burgoyne decided to attempt one more attack against the American positions to try to break through their defensive lines and continue south toward the Hudson River. But this time, the Americans were ready for him, and on October 7th, 1777, the second major battle at Saratoga took place, and this battle would prove to be the decisive engagement that would determine the outcome of the entire campaign. The British attacked the American left flank, and the fighting was intense and brutal, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in some places, and the British soldiers initially made progress against the American positions. But General Arnold, who was everywhere on the battlefield directing his troops and encouraging them to hold firm, led a counterattack that broke the British assault and drove the British soldiers back into their lines, and the American soldiers pursued the British with such ferocity that the British were forced to retreat to their fortified camp. The American victory at Saratoga on October 7th, 1777, broke Burgoyne's will to continue fighting, because his army had now suffered thousands of casualties in two major battles, because his supply situation was desperate with food running short and ammunition running low, and because he realized that his army was surrounded by an American force that was larger and growing every day, and because he understood that if he attempted to retreat north, back toward Canada, his army would be cut to pieces by the Americans who would harass his retreating columns every mile of the way. Faced with these circumstances, Burgoyne made the decision that would change the course of the American Revolution. On October 17th, 1777, he surrendered his entire army of approximately 5,700 soldiers to General Horatio Gates, the American commander who had replaced Arnold in formal command of the Northern Army, and this surrender was unconditional except for the provision that the British soldiers would be paroled and eventually exchanged for American prisoners held by the British. The implications of Burgoyne's surrender were immediately recognized by both sides as being far more significant than a simple military defeat, because a British army had surrendered in the field to an American army, something that had never happened before in the war, and this victory proved to the world that the Americans could defeat British soldiers in open battle, and that the revolutionary cause was not a hopeless rebellion that would be quickly crushed, but rather a serious military challenge to British authority. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.